Hello, my name's Roisin, and I am nearly 30. Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. So, as I said at the beginning of this video, I am nearly 30. I will be 30 in 18 and a half months, so not that long off at all. I'm not really that fussed about turning 30, like that reaching that milestone doesn't really scare me at all. I mean, I'm sure in the thumbnail I will be doing a terrible like, 30 face. But you know, that's just how linear time works, and I haven't yet worked out how to step out of the stream of linear time. And as far as I know, nor has anyone else. So we get older. But while I don't really care about turning 30 in any emotional way, I do like setting myself goals bound by a specific timeline, particularly numerical goals. Those things I love. I just like all the data and the counting. Often I don't meet the goals, but we set them anyway. And hopefully me setting this goal publicly will hold me to account. So this video, this goal, this idea was sparked by 3 different people. So the first one is Simon from Savage Reads, who is currently trying to read 40 classics before he turns 40. And so I thought I could do the same thing, except 30 classics, because I'm nearly 30. Sorry, Simon. Fair. Because I went through a phase when I was a teenager of reading a fair amount of classics, and I did my degree in classics, so ancient classics are things that I'm fairly well versed in, although, as you will see later, not as well versed as I wish I was. But also, I watched Seiji from The Artisan Geek talk about her challenging herself to read 12 classics last year, and how she realised that the list that she started with was all very Western, particularly very British, American, and because she's Dutch. And so she didn't expand outside of that, and that got me thinking that reading 30 more diverse classics would be something that I would be interested in, trying to read classics from other parts of the world, because although I wouldn't say my classics of Britain is particularly good, it's definitely better than anywhere else in the world. I've read, you know, Austen and Bronte and Dickens, so I have some understanding of the British classics and Shakespeare. I've read a fair amount of Shakespeare. The rest of the world, even from places like America or Scotland, my knowledge of the classics there are very much more limited. So I would like to read more broad classics. This is not to say that I won't be reading any English classics. I think I probably will be, but that I would like to not limit myself to just reading those classics that are on the UK secondary school curriculum that I missed for some reason. I want to expand outside of that. So I decided to set myself this challenge, but this video itself was sparked by Jean from Jean's Bookish Thoughts, who recently did a video on 30 books to read that she wants to read before she turns 30. They were just books, generally books that she already owned that she wanted to read over the next year. But so I thought that I could make a video about this too. However, I'm not going to list what 30 classics I've chosen, because I haven't yet chosen 30 classics. I'm going to talk to you today about 10 of the classics that I hopefully will read before I turn 30 in October 2022. I'm giving myself the room to research and discover in the future, and also I wanted you guys to help me. So if you have any recommendations for classics that I might not have read that you would like to leave in the description, lesser known classics, particularly if they are from outside of the UK-US classics sphere, if you've got any Latin American classics, the only African classic I've read is Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, but if there are others you would like to recommend me, or Asian classics, anything like that, I would love to hear ones that you have read and loved so that I can add them to my list. So as I mentioned, I have made a list of 10 classics that I would like to read. Some of these are English white classics, others are from further afield, but I would still say that I think these are all fairly well known classics, because I literally just went from things that I owned and things that I've already put on my Storygraph to be read shelf. So if there are any that you would recommend me that you think I won't know, I would love to hear that in the comments down below. Let's begin with the ones that I'm planning to read. The first one that I wrote down is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston. Last year I read Hitting a Straight Lick with a Crooked Stick by Zora Neale Hurston, which was all of her short stories that she had written that we still have access to, collected into one book. And I absolutely loved it. I loved her dialect. I thought that her characters were so sympathetic and wonderful. I thought there was a lot of nuance in her works, and I loved how clearly they were situated in a culture, that being African-American culture in the 1920s and 30s, particularly in Harlem and Florida. And I thought that I really loved the way that she wrote. I really loved her wit. So I would like to read Their Eyes Were Watching God, because that is her most famous seminal classic work. Their Eyes Were Watching God is about 16-year-old Janie, who is caught kissing shiftless Johnny Taylor, and so her grandmother swiftly marries her off to an old man with 60 acres. Janie endures 2 stifling marriages before she finally meets the man of her dreams, who offers her not diamonds, but a packet of flowering seeds. So it sounds like it's going to be really beautiful, really harrowing, and have a lot of the heart and wit that I expect from Hurston's work. Next, one that I know I have a copy of somewhere, but there's birds having a fight outside my window. Next is one that I know I have a copy of somewhere in this house, because I've definitely seen it recently, but is not here, and so I can't hold it up for you. But that is Love in the Time of Cholera by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Marquez is kind of the founder of magical realism, or one of the founders of magical realism. He is a Colombian writer from the early 20th century, and I have tried to read Love in the Time of Cholera before, and I was enjoying it, but I found it hard to stick to, and this was back when I wasn't reading as much as I am now, so I feel like I would do a better job now of reading it. In their youth, Florentino Aritza and Fermina Daza fell passionately in love. When Fermina eventually chooses to marry a wealthy, well-born doctor, Florentino is devastated, but he is a romantic. As he rises in his business career, he whiles away the years in 622 affairs, yet he reserves his heart for Fermina. Her husband dies at last, and Florentino purposefully attends the funeral. 50 years, 9 months, and 4 days after he first declared his love for Fermina, he will do so again. I really enjoyed the atmosphere of this novel, and that is something that I'm looking forward to getting back into. Then one that I could find the copy I own of, and that is Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak. I've mentioned before that I studied Russian at school. If any of you speak Russian, I apologise. But this is one of the classics from Russia that I'd like to read. I actually own quite a few, and I really wanted to read Russian classics, but I also find them really intimidating. But this one is my mum's favourite, which is why it's the one that I'm putting on my list that I want to read before I'm 30. Dr. Chivago is the epic novel of Russia in the throes of revolution and one of the greatest love stories ever told. Yuri Zhivago, physician and poet, wrestles with the new order and confronts the changes cruel experience has made in him, and the anguish of being torn between the love of 2 women. So it's one that's really, really famous, really well known, and set during the Russian Revolution, so excited to read it for that reason. There is another one that I do own, but this one I think is still at my mum's house, and that is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea by Yukio Mishima. This is a book that my dad gave me, and he really, really loves this book, so that's one of the reasons that I want to read it. And also, I haven't read any Japanese classics before. I think a lot of these are actually turning out to be 20th century classics, which is interesting. Anyway, a band of savage 13-year-old boys reject the adult world as illusory, hypocritical and sentimental, and train themselves in a brutal callousness they call objectivity. When the mother of one of them begins an affair with the ship's officer, he and his friends idealise the man at first, but it is not long before they conclude that he is in fact soft and romantic. They regard this disillusionment as an act of betrayal on his part, and the retribution is deliberate and horrifying. So, not something that I would usually pick up. It's very, very different from the classics that I'm usually drawn to, but because my dad loved it so much, that's why I've put it on this list. Next, a Chinese-American classic, and that is The Hanging on Union Square by H.T. Tsiang. In Depression-era New York, Mr. Nutt is an oblivious American everyman who wants to strike it rich. Over the course of a single night, he meets a cast of strange characters: disgruntled workers at a communist cafeteria, lecherous old men, sexually exploited women, and pesky authors, all of whom eventually convince him to cast off his bourgeois aspirations and become a radical activist. Absurdist, inventive, and suffused with revolutionary fervour, The Hanging on Union Square is a work of blazing wit and originality. I think this one is kind of a satire, which is what drew me to it, and also because it tells Depression-era American history, but from a very different perspective than you usually get with a kind of Steinbeck look of things. So I'm intrigued to that, and I want to read it for that reason. Also, I love this cover. I will put here. Rather than show you it on my iPad, I'll put it here. I really think that looks really good. So I'm very drawn to that one because someone talked about it and I cannot remember who because it was so long ago. Then another one I own, one of my Persephone classics, and that is Reuben, Sachs by Amy Levy. So this is just a short little book. And this is a British classic, but it is about British Jewish people. So that is kind of slightly different, although I suppose Daniel Deronda by George Eliot, I think, deals with the same thing, but I think Amy Levy was actually Jewish. Reuben Sachs, a feminist plea and a satire on the materialism of late Victorian Jewish people, much praised by Oscar Wilde. Amy Levy's tendency to melancholy, her growing deafness, and the simplistic condemnation of her novels as anti-Semitic by some may have contributed to her suicide when she was only 27. Jesus, that's interesting. So yeah, it's feminist and also satirical, which is really interesting, and I think it's going to be quite witty and funny, and I'm looking forward to it for that reason. Next on my list, another early 20th century classic, and that is The Ragged Trousered Philanthropists by Robert Tressel. The Ragged Trousered Philanthropist tells the story of a group of working men who are joined one day by Frank Owen, a journeyman prophet with the vision of a just society, indicting the philanthropy of the working class who toil solely for the benefit of their masters, and initiating them into the secrets of the great money trick which alienates them from their labour. Owen's attacks on the greed and dishonesty of the capitalist system rouse his fellow men from their political quietism. So I'm really... as you can probably tell from some of the books on this list, I really want to read more political classics, and also classics about the working classes, because I feel like a lot of the classics that I have read so far have been, you know, genteel ladies in sitting rooms, which have not been bad books, but I want to read more about different perspectives on the past, because not everyone was rich in the past, but I feel like that's a lot of the perspective that we get. Another one that I want to read that I think is kind of a queer classic, and is also really... a little more like light-hearted, I think, although probably there's some tragedy involved, but anyway, and that is Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe by Fanny Flack. The day Idgie Threadgood and Ruth Jameson opened the Whistle Stop Cafe, the town took a turn for the better. It was the Depression, and that cafe was a home from home for many. You could get eggs, grits, bacon, ham, coffee, and a smile for 25 cents. Ruth was just the sweetest girl you ever met, and Idgie, she was a character all right. You never saw anyone so headstrong. But how anybody could have thought that she murdered that man is beyond me. Oh, I didn't know that was in there. This is one that my mum has recommended to me over and over and over again, but I didn't know that it was about murder. That is interesting, but it is a mouth-watering tale of love, laughter and mystery. It will lift your spirits and above all remind you of the secrets to friendship. A richly comic, poignant narrative. So I was right, it is more light-hearted and funny, but I think different in terms of tone from a lot of the others on this list. Change in tone again, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, I have a degree in classics, but I'm not as well acquainted with some of the classics as I would like to be. So one that I would like to read that I bought fairly recently is The Aeneid by Virgil. So I've read the Odyssey, and that's the only one of what I consider the big four, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and Metamorphoses. I think Metamorphoses kind of falls off the end there, but I haven't read this cover to cover. I've read to about here, about 2/3 of the way through, but I want to read it again, and I particularly want to read this translation by Shadi Barsh, so I'll read it from the beginning, because the editions that I have are Penguin Classics, and although those can be really useful, and are often like the easiest to find and cheapest translations, I find they can be a bit old-fashioned, and that can make it feel a bit more alienating, like they write it as if Latin is the same as Victorian English, or late 18th century English, and it's not, obviously. It's a completely different language, so you can translate it into modern English if you want. I'll stop talking about translation now, but I do think that I really want to try and read the Aeneid properly, because I did kind of write my dissertation involving the Aeneid, but it was specifically about the four personifications in Ovid's Metamorphoses and the Aeneid, so I only read specific parts, but I feel like I should probably read it from start to finish. So this one is on my list for reasons of I should know this. I should know this by now. And then the final one that I want to read is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I feel like not having read any Virginia Woolf is kind of something big is missing from my knowledge of classics, and I need to rectify that by reading some Virginia Woolf. I have only just realised that most of these classics, with the exception of the Aeneid, are recent classics, as in from between 1880 and 1950, as opposed to any older classics, which is interesting because most of the classics I've read before have been sort of earlier, like mid-Victorian and before. So I guess I feel like my knowledge of 20th century classics isn't as well known, but also because I think that a lot of the more diverse classics are from more recent times. But if you have any recommendations for like 18th century or really early ones that you think are good, particularly if, as I mentioned before, they are outside of that like English and American canon, I would love to hear from you. To the Lighthouse is at once a vivid impressionistic depiction of family, the Ramsays, whose annual summer holiday in Scotland falls under the shadow of war, and a meditation on marriage, on parenthood and childhood, on grief, tyranny and bitterness. The novel's use of stream of consciousness, reminiscence and shifting perspectives gives it an intimate, poetic essence, and at the time of publication in 1927 it represented an utter rejection of all that had gone before. So I'm interested in that. I like books that play with form and do things something different, and this, as being one of the first books to step outside of the traditional form, is one of the things that draws me to it, as well as it being Virginia Woolf being an important thing to read if you're a feminist, I think. So those are on my list. So there you go. Those are the 10 that I'm hoping to read before I am 30. It's not definite. As long as I read 30 classics before I'm 30, then I think I've succeeded, even if I don't read these 10. But these are the ones that I'm thinking about at the moment. So as I mentioned, please recommend me classics in the comments down below. Anything that you think that I would like, that is particularly, as I mentioned, if it is more of a diverse classic, I would love to hear from you. And let me know if you do any challenges like this yourself. I'd love to hear how you think about classics. So thank you for watching. Please remember to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and do subscribe, because I put out new videos every Wednesday, Friday and Sunday, and so I will see you again very soon. Bye bye!